Welcome to the Climate Report. This is Hart Hagen, and I'm here with Nick Alden from Rochester, New York. Now, the purpose of the Climate Report is to solve the problem of climate change, all things considered, including the scientific aspects, but also including the aspects that deal with politics and propaganda and media, etc. So this time around, Nick and I are going to talk about something that you don't hear very much in the mainstream climate conversation, which is the positive role that cows can play, the positive role of grazing animals. So Nick, let's talk about grazing animals and Alan Savory and go from there. So what do we want people to know about grazing and the role it can play?
Well, I think a good place to start is to understand that during the Pleistocene, during the ice ages, there were more large animals on this continent, North America, than there are in the Serengeti today. There used to be a lot more big animals, and the big animals, the ruminants, they play a huge role in the cycle of decay in ecosystems and grasslands. So 2/3 of the ice-covered land is turning to desert because we removed all these animals from the land. We put them in the national parks, and because we're overgrazing them with farmland. So the combination of the overgrazing is obviously everybody's familiar with that. People they're really skeptical of the undergrazing being a problem. I think that the idea is, well, it's grass and it can only sustain so many animals, or I don't know how they think about it. My assumption is they think about grass as this limited resource, and that removing the animals would maybe even be good for the grass because it wouldn't be grazing. The truth is the animals actually break apart the soil with their hooves. They urinate and defecate on the soil, and this helps build up microbes in the soil, helps store soil and water in the soil. And it's really important that you have huge herds of grazing animals essentially till and fertilize the soil. And the Great Plains, whether it's the Great Plains of North America or the Serengeti in East Africa, the large numbers of animals essentially were always integral to these grassland ecosystems. You go to South America today, it's one of the poorest grasslands in terms of nutrients. They actually don't have because all their large animals went extinct in South America at the end of the last ice age. There is so little nutrients in South America's grasslands that, in fact, there's a kind of wolf that lives there that half of its diet is fruit. It has developed this communal relationship with the fruit because it just can't get enough nutrients from killing things.
So one thing we're saying is that grazing animals, use the term ruminants, it includes cows. You can maybe enlighten me at some point about what all is included in ruminants. But ruminants, you might think of them just herbivores, grazing animals, co-evolved with the grasslands, and that if we mimic the circumstances, if we mimic nature, it's called biomimicry, but if we mimic nature, then we can benefit the grasslands. When we let the grasslands go and don't have any grazing animals on them, then that's bad for the grasslands because they're not getting fertilized, and they're not, because you don't have the fertilizer, your plants aren't growing very well. When plants don't grow very well, they're not storing very much carbon in the soil. When you don't have very much carbon in the soil, the soil does not retain water very well. So it's just this process of degradation that takes place when there's a complete absence of grazing animals on the land.
That's right. I think what people are missing is that we're not doing something new to the land. We're doing to the land what is supposed to happen. It's more like putting a piece back that was missing than it is like adding something totally new and original.
Right. So if we have, the way planned grazing works is that if you wanted to mimic the natural circumstances, so the natural circumstances, think of the bison migrating northward and then southward. They're going to cross over the same spot about twice a year. They're going to intensively graze. They're going to keep moving. They're not going to stay on the same spot for more than a day or so. They're going to leave it graze. They're going to leave manure on it. And they're going to leave like indentations in the ground where their hooves have been. Those indentations can kind of hold water and rainfall. And then there's a period of rest where the grassland gets to rest for 3 months or 6 months or more.
That's right. It's very important. Without animals grazing the land, they just crumbles. The soils just crumble apart. And part of that is because of all the cycle of nutrients. There's all these microbes in the soil. The 1 teaspoon of healthy soil has something like more organisms in it than there are people on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you don't have animals doing that, those microbes don't get fed and the soil just erodes and crumbles. And the roots aren't there. The roots hold the soil, they hold the water. And then when the roots are gone, there's no framework to hold in anything, the carbon or the water.
And so let's look at that. So recently there was a headline in time.com that said Madagascar. You see, every few days you see an article, maybe every day you see an article that says climate change is causing drought. Drought is causing all these other bad things, because we know that plants and animals need water. Water is life. When you don't have enough water, then plants and animals die. And that's a problem. But the mistaken assumption is that all of this is caused by greenhouse gases. All of this is caused by too much CO2 and other greenhouse gases. And what we're not looking at is the changes in land use. That land can be used in a way that increases the quality of the land, increases the quality of the ecosystem, and you can do that profitably. Or land can be used in a way that degrades the land, degrades the soil, degrades the ecosystem. So, and that usually goes hand in hand with desertification. But when we see desertification, they attribute it to climate change and attribute climate change to greenhouse gases. I think that's stupid. It's
certainly it's certainly stupid to only attribute it to greenhouse gases, right?
Right.
If we stopped emitting CO2 10 years ago, we'd still have so much in the atmosphere. At least this is what the experts are saying.
Yeah.
That we'd still have so much greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that it'd cause all this warming. So we would need to draw it down. How do you draw it down? Well, you could do it through forests, except forests tend to be a wash. They tend to have as many trees fall to the ground and decay and release carbon as they absorb it. The big deposits of coal that we have, they formed in the Carboniferous, in coal swamps. Huge trees fell into these swamps, and because they were underwater, there's no fungi or insects that could eat them. The only thing comparable to that today are peat swamps, and there aren't enough peat swamps covering the world anymore to be able to do that. So you need something huge, and it turns out there's these grasslands that have been crumbling alongside these changes in climate. And what people ignore is how that crumbling is caused by the animals being removed. The droughts come in, the heat goes up, and what Alan Savory was bright enough to do was to realize that even if we didn't have fossil fuels, even if we never used them or burnt them, we would still have alarming, catastrophic climate change.
Yeah, one reason, I mean, this is a relatively complex issue that is oversimplified. So one reason that, most, like over a third of the carbon, over a third of the excess carbon currently in the atmosphere has come from soils as a result of deforestation, as a result of plowing, as a result of, chemical, synthetic fertilizers, synthetic pesticides, all the things that kill the life of the soil that causes a release of carbon. So I think there's a lot to talk about other than carbon, but if we're concerned about carbon, then we have to talk about soils. If you talk about soils, you have to talk about what's the optimal land use for each type of geographic area. And for lands that are suitable for agriculture, most of them are either historically they've been forests or historically they've been grasslands. So if a land has been historically forest, then it's smart to either plant trees or just allow trees to grow. If the land has been historically a grassland, it's smart to allow grazing animals through holistic planned grazing. Let the grazing animals rehabilitate the soil.
But yeah, and I feel like the connection that people make between cows and climate change is only through the Amazon. They imagine these monsters that you have to clear huge amounts of land for, and they release all the methane for their burps or whatever. There's this other side to cows when you manage them right. And it's funny. I was very angry as a teenager about the deforestation in the Amazon, like very rabid about it. I'm not for cutting down rainforests in any way, shape, or form. They're too precious. So, but it's funny how, no matter how many times you say, we just want holistic planned grazing, it's not received the way you would think it would be.
Okay, so let me talk a minute about the rainforest. It's, for time immemorial, what you see the United States media complaining about what's going on with the rainforest. Well, you have to understand the media as an instrument of propaganda. And it's going to be, the media is going to go to bat for powerful interests. And the powerful interests that sponsor the media don't want you to focus on the deforestation that occurs in the United States, the logging that occurs in the United States. So there's a guy named Chad Hansen, who's a PhD, JD. He's on the National Board of the Sierra Club. He studies forests a lot as part of his work. And he says, nobody in the world does more logging than the United States. So that's one thing. We have no moral authority to tell Brazil to stop clearing the Amazon. When we are doing all of this logging, we're doing a lot of it for so-called renewable energy. We're turning forests into wood chips and shipping them to Europe because they subsidize wood chips because it's classified as renewable energy. But we just have no moral authority to tell Brazil what to do with the Amazon. From the standpoint of climate, what you alluded to is true. It's not just carbon. It's the whole ecosystem. The whole ecosystem stores carbon, and the whole ecosystem can either preserve water or squander water. So when we deforest, whether it's North America, whether it's the Amazon, when we deforest, we're squandering a valuable asset. We're squandering an asset that might otherwise be able to store water, attract rainfall, and store carbon.
What's really important in Indonesia, for example, all the water gets stored in through the forest, it's slowly released. That's why they haven't cleared the tops of the peaks of many of the mountains there, so that it acts as a water catchment. But forests they're not just a nice thing to have. They are essential for the planet's survival, and for the animals and people. Although I'm curious about what you said about the logging. In the book In a Dark Wood that Alston Chase wrote back in the 90s, he wrote about this forester graduate from Oregon State. His name was Bob Zybeck. And according to him, He did a thesis where he looked at pollen samples, charcoal grains, logs from ships, interviews with natives, and the diaries of settlers, and he concluded that there was more old-growth rainforest then in the Pacific Northwest. There's more old-growth forest today than when white settlers arrived. Now, it would be impossible for me to prove it, even if it were true. But what I'm curious about now is, because if you look at old pictures from back in the 1900s, there were just little stands of old growth. You can see huge open areas. And of course, that ties into the wildfire management. Today, Bob Zybeck, who did this research, is largely involved in wildfire management and management of privately owned forests in Oregon. But I tend to like to have forests standing, especially pristine ones.
Oh yeah, of course. You know, and it's not just carbon, it's also water, it's also wildlife habitat. When you have an intact forest, there's so many benefits. Some of them are measurable financial benefits. Like Chad Hansen says that there's more employment in counties that have protected forests than counties that have unprotected forests. So the timber industry claims to be able to bring jobs. Well, there's more employment in places that have protected forests because you have, for one thing, more tourism. So.
Well, yeah, and I'm interested in figuring out how to manage these forests right because of all the wildfires that we're having. I'm interested also in what qualifies as pristine, and I look at this from a geological perspective. You know, because we forget that we were in and out of ice ages for thousands of years, and that what we are in right now is an interglacial, and they only last about 10 to 20,000 years, and they happen once every 100,000 years in a cycle. So I'm always curious, what's normal? And how do we measure it? My standard that I use is, what was the Earth like about 9 or 10,000 years ago? That would be ideal. You still have to factor in changes in climate that are not just what humans do, just that the climate naturally changes in all sorts of ways. So
Nick, we started off talking about Alan Savory and planned grazing. I think the takeaway there is that, you know, don't believe everything you hear in the mainstream media by any means. Don't believe what you hear when you hear the plant-based diet advocated. And there's a whole lot to know about how planned grazing, planned holistic management can help, you know, draw down carbon and restore grassland ecosystems. So how about if we talk about that more on another episode?
that'd be great. I'd love to do that.
Okay, thanks.